This presentation is focused on understanding the drivers of climate change risk perceptions among forest stakeholders in Maine, which is in the northeastern United States. And climate change is impacting both natural and human systems globally. In particular, forests are impacted by climate change environmentally, economically, and socially. So climate change has environmental consequences for forests, particularly in regards to changes in wildlife populations or tree species distributions. Climate change also has economic consequences. So this may affect timber quality and timber availability for the forest industry. And finally, climate change has social implications for forests. Many people rely on forests for their well-being. Many people also rely on forests for tourism and recreation, which is impacted by climate change. Forests also provide many ecosystem services, such as clean water and air, food, fuel, recreation, carbon sequestration, cultural values, and aesthetic values. But management decisions can impact the provisioning of these ecosystem services. So we need to consider the combination of climate change along with management practices, and specifically adaptation strategies, that can address the impacts of climate change and therefore increase the ability of forest systems to respond to change. In this study, we draw on the climate change risk perception model to understand the determinants of climate change risk perceptions. We are interested in risk perceptions because they can impact adaptation implementation among forest stakeholders, therefore affecting the provisioning of ecosystem services. So climate change risk perceptions are a subjective mental construct of one's own personal feelings towards a severity and or likelihood of a threat or occurrence. So on the right here, we have van der Linden's climate change risk perceptions model, which states that cognitive factors, so knowledge about the causes and the impacts of climate change, as well as knowledge about how to respond to climate change, so this is related to self-efficacy. Cognitive factors increase perceived risk. Also important is experience, so experience with climate change impacts, as well as the emotional processing that is associated with those experiences. And so more experience and more negative emotions have been shown to increase perceived risk. Next, sociocultural influences are really important here. So this is related to social norms regarding beliefs in climate change, as well as values. So having high biospheric values or caring about the environment have been shown to increase perceived risk. Finally, there are a variety of socio-demographics that are important to understanding perceived climate change risk. So the position that you may serve, age, gender, as well as political affiliation. This study takes place in Maine. Maine is in the northeastern United States. It has a highly diverse forest system with over 50 tree species, as well as a diversity of forest stakeholders, including those working in the forest industry, commercial land managers, as well as small private woodlot owners, those working in government, as well as tourism and recreation. In addition, forestry supports more than 30,000 jobs with an economic impact of $8.5 billion. So it's really important with this diverse forest system and the diversity of forest stakeholders to understand those factors that influence climate change risk perceptions. Also, given the diversity of Maine's forest system, what we learn from this study can also be applied to many other regions of the world. So in order to understand the drivers of climate change risk perceptions, we conducted an online survey of 2 main forest stakeholder groups. This included a group of small woodlot owners as well as commercial land managers. And we used gatekeepers, or those that have a close connection with these 2 stakeholder groups, to gain access and to increase response rate. We also sent out several reminders to also increase response rate. In total, we had a little over 200 responses. Most measures were assessed using 5-point Likert scales, and so we asked a variety of questions related to socio-demographics, specifically gender and political affiliation, as well as knowledge about the causes of climate change, so belief in anthropogenic climate change, as well as self-efficacy or knowledge about how to respond to climate change. We also asked about experience with climate change impacts and emotional processing related to those impacts. And finally, we were interested in sociocultural influences, such as social norms and values. And the reason that we were interested in these measures or constructs is because they have been shown to be related to risk perceptions in the previous slide in the van der Linden model. As I said previously, measures were assessed on 5-point Likert scale, so strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we used a regression to explain the variance in risk perceptions. So I'm going to share some quick results related to the dependent variable, which was climate change risk perceptions, just to highlight some key results that illustrate high perceptions of climate change risk. So 76% of forest stakeholders in Maine that we surveyed believe that climate change will have a significant impact on Maine's forest ecosystems within the next 50 years. So this is high, and this is similar to other studies conducted in the US and several European countries. A little less so, but still high, 60% believe that climate change presents a threat to forest ecosystems. So if you notice the difference in wording, we have significant impact within the next 50 years versus threat. So this may indicate that climate change is viewed as maybe having some positive outcomes, and or it may indicate that climate change is perceived as happening in the distant future, so within the next 50 years versus happening now. So now I want to get into the regression results to illustrate which independent variables or drivers of climate change risk perceptions were significant. So in the final model, in the last column, I want you to focus there. Highlighted in red are those independent variables that were significant predictors of climate change risk perceptions. So the significant predictors in the final model included cause knowledge. So this was knowledge about the causes of climate change. It's a belief in anthropogenic climate change, as well as personal experience and affect or emotional processing related to those experiences. Those significantly predicted risk perceptions. And finally, social norms significantly predicted risk perceptions. And overall, our model explains 72% of the variance in climate change risk perceptions, which is high. In van der Linden's study of the UK public, he was able to explain about 70% of the variance in climate change risk perceptions. So some of the implications of this study. So we found the importance of place-based experiences of environmental disturbances, so experiences with specific climate change impacts, as well as personal belief in climate change, were significant predictors of climate change risk perceptions. We did not find that self-efficacy or perceived control over risks were a significant predictor, but those have previously been identified. And our research supports the idea that forest owners rely on social norms for risk assessments as well, seen as norms with a significant predictor of risk perceptions. However, social norms often don't appear in analyses of forest stakeholders in regards to explaining climate change risk perceptions. So this is an important finding and something that needs to be further analyzed and studied. In terms of communication and outreach with forest stakeholders, to try to discuss the impacts of climate change and potentially increase climate change risk perceptions or elicit broad support for adaptation actions, specific outreach campaigns and communication efforts can appeal to forest stakeholders' experience with climate change impacts and their associated emotions. So thinking about which climate change impacts they experience the most, such as insects and pathogens, or extreme precipitation events. So discussing those impacts and how they're related to climate change may be one way to address climate change risk perceptions. It also may be important to engage in conversations with organization or industry leaders to address social norms. So by discussing climate change with these key stakeholders, we may be able to think about how to increase climate change risk perceptions among a broader audience. Some of the next steps in this research. So previous research has identified position or role, so be it commercial land manager, landowner, working in the government, as well as where they are situated in place as important dimensions of climate change risk perception. So we may be able to incorporate those constructs into our model to explain more of the variance in risk perceptions. We also want to explore the role of experience and whether or not that experience with climate change impacts is attributed to climate change impacts, and how that might affect climate change risk perceptions. And finally, we also want to carry out some similar methods to identify the drivers of adaptation implementation using regression, so with adaptation as a dependent variable. So I want to thank all my survey participants, you Maine faculty and students for pre-testing this survey. I also want to thank the USDA and AFRI and Avangrid for their financial support. Thank you.